Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Ruby live event. My name is Chef Ken Rubin, and we have open office hours today. This is a time when you can basically ask me any question related to cooking or cooking technique. This is a 1-hour session really designed to help support you, whatever questions you have related to cooking. Of course, we touch sometimes on the area of health and wellness as it relates to food and cooking. But bring the questions that you have around your Ruby courses to me during this time. So if you're new to our live event platform, getting your question posted is quite simple. You'll see next to where I'm speaking a little dialog box where you can type in your question. Add that to the back end to moderate by clicking on the add button, and then you'll see it on the right-hand side. Once you see a question that you're interested in other words, a question that you want to have me answer, go ahead and click that little heart next to it. That will raise it up on the list so I get to it just a little bit faster. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and dive right into some of the questions. I can see a fair number of questions already, so thank you in advance for going in and populating some of these initial questions. So initial question from Sarah here about the air fryer. We get a lot of questions about the air fryer on Ruby. She says there's a lot of craze over the air fryer. Can I create the same results with convection or other cooking? Thank you so much for your support. Sarah, absolutely. There are ways to mimic what the air fryer does with a convection oven on a high temperature, 450 Fahrenheit or thereabouts. Also really being sure that whatever it is you're cooking, you've cut into fairly small pieces so that they cook quickly and evenly and those sorts of things. Even elevating it on a rack within your convection oven makes a lot of sense. The air fryer essentially is just a little mini convection oven. The reason why they tend to work so well and provide such good results is that cooking chamber is quite small in most cases. And because of that, it can get hot very quickly. It can stay hot. It can regulate that temperature without having some of the fluctuation that you might see in your home oven. You're opening it, you're closing it. If you set the home oven to 425 or 450, you might have some fluctuation below that might impact how crispy something gets or how evenly it might cook. The air fryer is just really well designed to do that. The only real drawback for me and why I don't use one that often, let's say, is that I'm cooking for a family or cooking for a group, and they're just a little bit on the small side for me. So I can mimic those results with a little bit of planning in a convection oven and have a lot more volume output potentially. But great question. Next question here from Laura. When cutting food with my chef's knife, the food tends to stick to the blade, thereby forcing me to slide it off the blade every few cuts. That slows me down, makes my cutting board messy, and my cuts hardly even. Any tips? So yeah, Laura, this is fairly common. I would say don't be discouraged by it. I find that the kind of, the nature of the food as it's coming off the knife has, a lot to do with the knife itself, kind of, what is the width of that knife, kind of how heavy is that knife. I found that using a thinner style chef knife, like more of a Japanese style chef knife even, might provide some slightly better results for some people, cutting, compared to more the European style that might just be a little bit wider, a little bit of a different shape, along that blade. The other thing you might consider is there's a design on some types of blades called cullens, and these are essentially little divots sometimes that you'll see spaced kind of equidistant on the knife on both sides of the blade that are designed to kind of create just a very small kind of point of differentiation along the knife to kind of create an air gap to create less of that stickiness or that kind of, the food not wanting to kind of roll off that blade. I have some knives with them. I find them to be, somewhat effective, but really more it's what I'm cutting. It's the slicing style or cutting style and the shape of the blade for me. Otherwise, if you're cutting starchy foods like potatoes, root vegetables and things, those might tend to also kind of want to stick to the blade more than other sorts of things, for sure. Next question here from Vicky about fresh vegetables. Should I parboil or blanch before freezing? Cook for one, and some vegetables such as cauliflower are large. Yeah, so Vicky, if you're just one person and you buy a whole cauliflower and you want to find a way to extend that life of the cauliflower, I think certainly freezing, portioning and freezing part of that makes a lot of sense. I do tend, when I'm freezing most vegetables, to go through just that initial cooking process, kind of a quick par cooking process, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 90 seconds, depending on the vegetable and how large it's cut, these sorts of things. It does make it better in terms of the final outcome when you do par cook a vegetable, because on that kind of freezing, thawing, reheating process, you're going to have a lot less degradation and breakdown and change in kind of the cellular structure of those vegetables. They're going to just be a lot more alive feeling when you go through that process. Next question. In your opinion, what are the staple and must-have spices and herbs to have in the kitchen? Many thanks. So I would say, just really largely depends on the types of flavors and the types of cooking that you like. It really varies by the kind of ethnic cuisines or the flavors that your family appreciates, or how adventurous you might be with flavors. I like to keep a wide variety of spices, dried spices that are whole. I'll tend to grind them myself just for freshness, and then fresh and dried herbs as well. I like to keep lots of both on hand. I grow fresh herbs, so those tend to work out pretty well in terms of having like a lot of diversity. You don't need a garden to grow fresh herbs, by the way. If you have a sunny windowsill in your kitchen or some other room, that could be a good place to do that. Next question. This is about fruit paste. We get a lot of questions about sweeteners and alternative sweeteners here at Rouxbe. One of the things that we oftentimes recommend for people who are trying to reduce the use of refined sugars and things like this is the use of a fruit paste. For those of you who are unfamiliar, this is essentially taking a dehydrated fruit, such as a dried mango or dried apple. You can use dates, you can use really any dried fruit, and then rehydrating that in liquid, and then removing the liquid just so you have enough liquid to puree that, so it creates a very sweet but whole food based sweetener. It's kind of a paste you could use as a spread, as an addition to recipes to sweeten things. So the question here is a good one. It's kind of about the process of fruit paste. And Barbara says, I'm reviewing the fruit paste recipe. I'm puzzled by the need to drain the soaking water and add new. Doesn't the soaking water contain nutrients that might be beneficial? So Barbara, in this case, it's a very small amount of liquid, and I would say the nutrient capacity is fairly minimal. The reason why we have you drain that liquid is we really want to make sure that we're measuring and moderating the amount of liquid that goes into when you blend. So you can certainly reserve some of that liquid that you used for soaking for that blending process. But the reason why I want you to drain is because we really want you to moderate and measure out some very small amount of liquid just to have enough to make that move in the Vitamix or in the blender, so that you get that really amazing thick puree without having it be too watery, too runny. But that's kind of the rationale for that draining step. But you can use that liquid if you wish. Next question here from Laura. When steaming green vegetables, and given that steaming requires a lid to cover the steaming basket, how can you prevent the veggies from leaching out their acid and losing their pigments and vibrant colors while at the same time steaming properly? So Laura, this is a really interesting question. It's a delicate balancing act when you're steaming to have some, amount of, really good coverage. You want to keep that steam in. It's the heat from the steam and the convection of the steam moving around food that cooks the food, that kind of makes the heat transfer possible. We also know that, and you pointed out that when you have a completely closed system, that some of the acids that might develop and circulate because of the chlorophyll and some of the natural acidic components in vegetables, over time and with that heat, those acids can begin to degrade the color and mute some of those colors. So when you look at something like a traditional bamboo steamer basket, those kind of work really well in part because they're, quote unquote, airtight to a certain extent. They do let out small amounts of steam, but they're a pretty good closed system. They kind of do the job. So I recommend for people when you're steaming things, and this really only applies to like longer duration steaming. If you're steaming something for just a few minutes, tight lid, no problem, right? But if you're steaming something for longer and you're worried about the acids from those vegetables degrading, you can essentially just kind of prop that lid open, let some of that steam and some of those acids escape. You can also just finish it a little bit early, kind of turn it off, let that heat settle a bit, and just, again, take that lid off. You're going to have, when you're steaming, a tremendous amount of residual heat in that pan that will provide carryover cooking. So you can really steam till it's partially cooked, turn it off, pop the lid, let it kind of steam out and finish that cooking process. Next question here from Dawn. Hi, Ken. Some recipes for casseroles and other dishes say to bake covered. Some say uncovered, and some say cover the last 10 minutes. What's the point of covering dishes? What does it do for the dish? So when you're cooking a casserole or something like in a casserole dish, stuffing, or you're doing something that has kind of a matrix where you're really trying to heat it evenly. You're using kind of the heat from the oven, but having the creation of some steam and maintaining a cover and some steam might actually help that casserole cook a little bit faster, a little bit more evenly. So covering is, kind of accelerate cooking, promote evenness, because the covering has that steaming effect. It also, in many cases, prevents drying out of the casserole. Now, you do mention in your question that sometimes they say to bake uncovered or uncovered for the last 10 or 20 minutes. That's all in an effort to kind of balance that cooking and trying not to dry it out, with having, in many cases on a casserole, some kind of a texture or color on top of the casserole. So you might want to finish it by having some little crispy edges, or the top is a little bit browned, or maybe have a slightly different texture than the interior of that casserole. So by taking off the lid or foil or uncovering it, you're allowing for that dish to expose all that moisture, to slough off all that liquid, and to create the opportunity for it to kind of brown or crisp up in that way. It'll never crisp up if it's covering, because it's just going to be steaming the whole time. Next question here is from Jane. What is the advantage of the Essentials course to receive the certificate? What does their certificate do or allow us that we couldn't do otherwise? Jane, I think you're asking about the Forks Over Knives Essential versus the Ultimate course. Both of them do culminate in a certificate of completion. The certificate is really, dependent on the learner and what your goals are. We do have some learners who use completion for, in some cases, things like professional development hours or continuing education, things on this order. But for people who are just with us to learn on their own, who aren't concerned with completing or getting a certificate or having anything like that, if you just want to use our resource and the course itself to better yourself, to make your kitchen skills better, then that's great. There's no requirement whatsoever in any of our courses that you graduate or complete or fulfill the requirements for the certificate. We're here to serve you and how you want to learn. And if that's not your goal, that's perfectly fine. Next question is from Sheila. Looks like Sheila Cry, longtime friend of mine from IACP. Hello, Sheila. She has a question. Have you seen an increase in recreational online cooking classes during the pandemic? Yeah, I think the answer is yes. I think that many online organizations, especially those in things like food or other areas that people found essential or comforting during the pandemic, I think we definitely saw a lot of increase in interest and activity. Many people during the pandemic, quite frankly, just maybe realized for the first time that they weren't great at cooking or didn't have a lot of cooking skills. So we definitely saw a lot of people who came to us just to improve their ability to cook for their family, being a lot more dependent on home cooked meals versus going out to eat and things like this. Also, a lot of interest, I would say, in the health and wellness side. I think that the pandemic definitely caused a lot of people to think about their own health, their wellness, their mortality, and things like this in different ways. So cooking also plays into that, where people want to take more control over their own destiny with food and have a better relationship to food. Really applying some of the things we know squarely around lifestyle health and nutrition and diet, and do more of the walking of the walk versus that talking part. So we definitely saw a lot of students come to us very eager to dive in, to adopt new habits, new skills, and kind of turn that habit over and focus on cooking as that primary way to activate it. So really, really great that we were able to do that amongst lots of other organizations as well. Next question here from Blair. Blair says, "Hi, Ken. I lost 50 pounds on a high protein, low carb diet and gained 30 pounds back because it's not sustainable. I'm new to forks over knives, but it looks sustainable. I'm concerned if I embrace forks over knives and eat starch, I'll gain the remainder of what I lost." So Blair, number one, I'm not a medical doctor. I think if you're, managing your weight and that's a primary goal of yours, having the guidance of your healthcare professional would be really important in this conversation. I will say from a culinary perspective that, people do find that a diet like forks over knives or any other whole food plant-based diet, it certainly does include starch. It includes lots of whole grains, lots of starchy vegetables, root vegetables, tubers, things on this order, and also includes obviously tons and tons of vegetables. So super high fiber, high in micronutrients of all sorts, and just a different approach than the high protein, low carb approach. Many people find weight loss to be not a problem at all in this diet because these foods are typically not very calorically dense and from a nutrient perspective, very, very high in terms of value. But I'll say that, for most people who are dealing with starches and things like this, kind of trying to fight sugars or carbs or this kind of narrative, the real battle for most people is on refined sugars, processed starches, white flour, these sorts of things that are, the underpinnings of, kind of many people's diet. So when you make the transition to a forks over knife style diet, I'll just kind of make the appeal that it's not that you're having carbs and starches, it's really the quality of those vegetables and the larger context of all the other foods that you're eating that makes up for that difference. So hopefully that helps answer your question. Next question from Robin, chef's knife question. I need to purchase one. I've never used one and want to get your advice on size. Everyone says start with an 8-inch, but I really think I might love a 10-inch for longer term. What is your favorite size and any reason not to start with 10-inch? Everyone's preference is a little bit different. I actually prefer, on the whole, knives for me when I'm just cooking at home to be smaller and lighter. When I was doing a lot more professional work in a kitchen where I had to just, you know, get through dozens of pounds or cases of produce, a bigger, heavier knife sometimes kind of helped you do the work a little bit more efficiently or faster. The knife weight, even in that case, kind of helps do some of the work for you. I'll say that it's really just very much based on personal preference. I myself don't own any chef knives that are 10 inches. Most of my chef knives are probably in the 7.5-inch to 9-inch type range. A lot of different styles of chef knives, but 10 inches is a fairly large knife. I would say 8 is more common for most home cooks. If you are a very large person, tall person, big hands, then yeah, maybe a bigger knife would also make sense for you. I find that a lot of it has to do with the grip and the balance and kind of the way it feels with what you're cooking a lot of. Question from Vicky: when cooking beans and other items, it says to start with cold water. How come? So it's a question we get a lot on Ruby. If we're boiling pasta or boiling beans or doing something and you have a hot water tap, why not add hot water to the pot and just start with hot water versus starting with cold water? And the answer really has to do with, ultimately kind of flavor on one hand and also safety. So it's typically not super safe to like walk around the kitchen with a hot pot of water. If it's coming out of the tap, not really a burn issue, more of just like a hassle if that were to splash or something else. But really more about flavor. Your hot water heater is great for getting water hot. But think about it from the perspective that most hot water heaters, when they're heating water, also have potentially some mineral buildup or some deposits or some other things that might create some off flavors in that water. So I would just kind of preface by saying like hot water coming out of a hot tap is going to have some different flavor components of water that's just coming straight through the cold system and that hasn't had any of that heating, that might just give some flavors depending on how old your hot water heater is and things like this. So your stove and the kind of the setup that you have for heating water is going to do a really great job. It might take an extra few minutes, but I would just say it's just better overall to kind of let your hot water heater do that job for like washing dishes and things like that versus things you might want to consume ultimately. Donna has a question here. What is the best way to compile recipes when working as a personal chef? Do cooks use recipes for meal plans, such as forks over knives? Must someone create all their own recipes? So Donna, if you're, just working as a personal chef and you are preparing food for your clients, there's going to be a lot of different ways that you can kind of collect recipes. Any number of, kind of recipe aggregator type things, or like an Evernote food, places to kind of store those links. So you're going online, you find a few blogs or some recipe websites with recipes that are interesting to you, or links to a meal planner that you're maybe interested in. And, there's ways to kind of consolidate, or you can organize. Chefs in restaurants, of course, have very complex ways of managing recipes and costing recipes, having purchasing, kind of worksheets and things like this to help people really understand all the different requirements when it comes to, kind of having an operation and having efficiencies within an operation. But in those cases, that's you cooking for someone, and you're not claiming ownership over the recipe or selling the recipe or publishing the recipe. You're just using it as a launching point to prepare something. So you don't need to create your own recipe. You can certainly like take a recipe from a cookbook that you like and make that for your client. When it comes to publishing, you're going to want to make sure that anything you publish or share in a newsletter, or you're selling to someone as part of a consulting job, they want you to devise a plan for 5 new bean recipes, whatever. Those need to be original. Obviously, you can't take those from some other source and just put your name on it. But otherwise, I would just say there's really any number of resources, tools for managing recipes, but you don't need to develop your own just to cook for someone. Next question here from Kenneth. What do you suggest will be a good follow-up course or books that will continue to enhance my growth, especially if I was possibly considering one day becoming a professional chef? Well, I would say, there are really endless resources out there. I myself have, 40 years almost of having this, passion for reading about food and collecting cookbooks. I started collecting cookbooks when I was pretty young, when I first started to read instead of comic books. So I've got a lot of books and a lot of things that have really inspired me along the way, and things that have helped me as a professional, things that have helped me think about food differently, things that have helped me cook differently. And really, it's a huge list. It runs the gamut from philosophy to technical to operational, financial, all kinds of other sorts of things play into development and these sorts of things over time. There are many, many books that I can credit, but one really important book in particular that a lot of chefs credit is a book by a really important author, a food scientist, Harold McGee, a book called On Food and Cooking. And this is a book that really, for me, was one of those kind of go-to sources of knowledge that covered everything from history, product identification, food science, basics of nutrition, big book, 800 pages or whatever it is, but like encyclopedic, but really, really well written and really useful from a practical perspective. One of those things that just adds a lot of richness and a lot of depth to food. So if there's one book, I think that's one of the really good ones. Of course, many, many professional reference books out there that can help guide you. Another question here from Kenneth. Do you think following recipes is okay, or becoming more authentic when cooking is better? Yeah, so I think your question is getting at, is cooking more about following a recipe or having more a sense of your own self through your food? I think it really just depends on your approach. I love following people's recipes and feeling like I'm being guided by an expert who had a certain vision, a certain idea in mind. I also really love taking a recipe idea and just using it as an idea and saying, well, what do I have in my fridge, or what's going to come out of the garden, or what do I feel like eating, and what are my kids going to like to eat, and modifying, adapting, choosing it in a way where a recipe is more of an inspiration point, and then I'm going to cook something that I want based on that. So I think both have tremendous merit. I'll be honest in that I struggled for many years as a chef, being really hesitant to follow someone's recipe because I always felt like my take was going to be better. And I just found that, there's a lot of amazing experts out there. They wrote the recipe for a reason. It's done really well. And even though my take might be good, there's a certain honor and a certain integrity about understanding where someone's point of view was, and, kind of keeping that perspective first and foremost before you go off and want to modify or adapt too much. Next question here. Can you review the dry saute method? Best type of pan, finding the right temperature, etc. So Janelle, this is one of the top questions I'll say from our students, especially those who are looking to reduce the use of oil in their cooking. This is a technique for sauteing without oil that uses a flavorful liquid or even water, if that's all you have. And really the process requires For me, just a good stainless steel pan. That's my preferred, thing to cook on. So a 10 or 12-inch stainless steel pan, having a small amount of flavorful stock on hand, and having those vegetables cut in a way that's going to be kind of the right shape and size for what your application is. And that's going to be important because what you're really looking for is even cooking and not having things sticking. Excuse me while my puppy's greeting someone at our door here. But really what I like to do is I like to heat that pan till it gets very hot. The water test is one way to really establish that pan is hot enough. That's when you take a teaspoon or a small half a teaspoon of water. You put that water on the pan. You want it to almost float like a mercury ball on top of that pan. And that's the thing that's going to let you know that you're at the right temperature. I think from there, the next thing that you want to do is really make sure that your timing is set up properly. The timing is going to be important because you don't want that food to like sit on the bottom of the pan for too long, become overly brown, or even stick to the pan. What you really want to do is make sure you're getting the level of coloration that you want. In some cases, you don't even want coloration if you're doing more of a dry sweat versus a dry saute. But if you're doing a dry saute, you want to determine what is the amount of color that I want, how much color will I tolerate. Sometimes you want to really get, some nice brown color on those onions. Sometimes you don't. And let that be kind of your guiding principle, the thing that really kind of shapes what that looks like. The minute that you begin to sense that your pan is getting too hot, you've got too much coloration, it's moving too quickly, you can flash the pan with a small spoonful of that flavorful liquid, so the water or the stock, whatever it might be. And you can also just take the pan off the heat. People always forget that you're trying to remove heat from the pan. Well, just lift it off the fire, move it away from the heat. And that's going to be the thing that actually allows you to moderate pan temperature really, really well in that case. The other thing I'll just mention from the perspective of dry saute is I mentioned the dry sweating. Don't be afraid to go less temperature, no oil, and coax out some flavor from those vegetables. It does bring out the sweetness. It will bring out some of those other things. So have a sense of that as well. Next question. Question's a two-part one. Can you describe the proper pan temperature for sweating onion and how to know the pan is the correct temperature? When making a no-oil bechamel, what is the best way to prevent the onions from browning? So when you're sweating, your temperature can be really, really low. You don't want to even hear anything in the pan. Sauteing has an audio component. You can hear the sizzle. You can hear, what amounts to kind of that frying, quote unquote, in the pan. Sweating is going to be pretty quiet. It's a very gentle, it's not a specific temperature. If you're right around 300, 320 degrees, you're probably good. Whereas a saute is more like 380, 400 degrees Fahrenheit. If you're trying to prevent onions from browning, turn your temperature down. That's the number one thing you should do. So if it's getting too hot, that will be the thing, the temperature that's converting those sugars and beginning to kind of get that Maillard effect or even caramelizing with that temperature. So if your onions are too brown, less time, less temperature. You can even add some water or some stock to slow it all down. Next question coming here from Rob. I am still struggling with sauteing fish in a pan. The fish is getting stuck. Any tips? So thank you, Rob. I would say that you're also probably struggling with pan temperature here. One of the important things around anytime you're cooking animal protein is to have a hot enough pan. Another thing with animal protein and fish in particular is having that wet when it goes into the pan. So make sure whatever it is you're cooking, that it's really blotted dry with a paper towel or a dry cloth. That way when it goes into the pan, it's not fighting and splattering with that liquid, and it creates that exterior that then can move off the pan more more easily. Next question. I noticed a lot of recipes that call for corn or peas will say fresh or frozen. They never include canned as an option. What is it about canned veggies? Too much salt? So Don, the thing about canned vegetables is that you don't know what they processed it with. It could be salt. It could be some flavorings or seasonings or spices in some cases. But typically the sodium content is going to be the number one detractor. Also, the quality of canned vegetables in many cases just tends not to be as good as fresh or frozen. Frozen is actually a really, really great way to balance cost, quality, vibrancy, freshness, and some of those other things. There's nothing wrong with canned vegetables. They'd typically be kind of lower or last on my list in terms of options because of the lack of control I would have. If it's just peas frozen in a bag, it's just going to be peas, no other salt or other unusual things that they might add to enhance it or maintain color or any of those sorts of things. Next question coming here from Kathy. I have an allergic reaction to all garlic, scallions, and onions. I sometimes replace these with fresh fennel or water chestnuts, but they don't really give a great taste. Any ideas you can suggest? Yeah, so fennel and water chestnuts have much, much different flavor profiles than, the flavor you might get from like a garlic or a scallion, a leek, an onion, any of those sorts of things. So if you have an allergic reaction to those, I'll just say, one thing you might do is experiment to see if it's really about those foods themselves or if it's those foods in a raw state. Some people are very sensitive to those foods if they're more raw, but are okay if they're in a cooked format. So that'd be the first question. The second thing would be, just to note that there are some ways to slightly replicate those flavors. They're pretty specific to those vegetables. Those are important vegetables. That whole, allium family. They give a unique flavor set because of the kind of aromatics that they have. They have a slight sulfurous kind of compound component. The thing that some people have found useful to create a little bit of that flavor is a ingredient used in Indian cuisine. It's an ingredient that needs to be used with great care and great sensitivity because it is very strong and can easily overpower your food. It's called, in recipes, oftentimes referred to as hing or asafoetida, typically purchased at international markets or at Indian markets. It's something that you want to close tightly in the container and even store in another sealed bag in some cases because it does smell garlicky, oniony. It does smell like a very pungent version, even though it's not related. So it's the kind of answer in India for that flavor profile without adding anything from the allium family properly. Next question. Hello, Chef. Is there any connection to Bob's Red Mill and Rouxbe? Just noticed that many of their products are shown in videos and photos throughout the program. No formal connection at all. We're just a fan of their products. I happen to live in Portland, Oregon, just about a mile from the Bob's Red Mill World Headquarters. So I'm very, very familiar with their products and just have a great admiration for what they've done for the natural foods world and for everyone who loves to bake and eat whole grains and beans and things. We tend to, within our videos, showcase products that we in real life, use and know and trust. So that's why we have some of those Bob's Red Mill type products represented. Next question. I signed up for the ultimate class and got derailed by life events. Do I have to finish it by a set date? So yeah, Cynthia, typically we have kind of a certain cadence within our courses. If you reach out to our customer service team, Shoshana or Dee or Keegan or Dante, one of the great people on the support team would be happy to kind of walk you through your options without kind of knowing your details. I don't want to give you any guidance that might not be true, but if you just buzz them and let them know, they'll give you some ideas of what you might do next. Next question here. Is the seasoned cast iron skillet at odds with no oil cooking? What are your thoughts on cast iron skillets? Well, gosh, Chad, this is a interesting question, one that might get me into some trouble. But I happen to think that when you use oil on something like cast iron, to make it nonstick, to make it essentially a sealed type cooking surface, that you're really not using oil in that context as an ingredient. It's not something you're adding as part of the recipe. There's very little to no discernible oil at all that would appear on the food. The oil in this context is really more of like a utility on the pan. Is there some discernible oil? Yeah, there is. It's probably not measurable in any real sense. So I would say that the benefit of cooking on a well-seasoned cast iron pan in a no oil context far outweigh any negative association you might have with that minute amount of oil. I think there are a lot other more important things to focus on, frankly, in terms of either health or the aesthetics when you get to that kind of level of detail. So I would say go with cast iron. It's going to help you achieve better texture, better flavor, deeper flavor development in some cases on your food. It's going to make a big difference because of the technique you can use with a heavy pan like a cast iron pan that you couldn't with a lighter style pan. Edward has a question. What are your recommendations regarding a starter cooking set for online culinary classes? I was told Calphalon or Maiden, also knives. I would say it really just depends on your budget. There are lots and lots of great reputable cookware companies. Any cookware store is going to have options at various price points. I own pots and pans from a dozen different companies and probably two different knife companies. So I would say I'm not brand loyal. I like equipment that works for me. Calphalon works well. All-Clad works well. There's many, many brands of pots and pans that work well. Really, for me, always comes down to, the economics. Like, does it make sense for you to purchase something or invest in something at a certain price point? For me, I do consider it to be an investment. So it's a little bit more money, but it'll last 5 or 10 more years. Fine. But also things like the weight. Some people don't want a pan that's too heavy, whereas for me, I love having a heavy pan. I like the way it cooks, but for some people, it's just too much to lift or too much to clean. It's a deal breaker for them. So I would encourage you to look at different pans, Edward, kind of hold them, see what fits. Imagine yourself cooking the foods that you cook and, see what works for you. The right pans should really last a lifetime. So next question, what are good substitutes for onions and garlic from a flavor standpoint? We don't use these ingredients and don't use oil in our cooking. What are the techniques I can utilize to bring out the best while cooking oil-free and without these ingredients? Well, certainly lots of other foods have great flavor. So if those are some ingredients that you tend not to use, you can certainly find ingredient building, flavor building capacity with other ingredients. And that's a great way to kind of approach various things that you want to cook, is to kind of step back and say, what are my overall flavor goals with this dish? Do I want it to be, rich and earthy? Is it really mushroomy? Is it bright? Is it aromatic? Is it uplifting? What are the things you're kind of going for on that dish, and finding the right ingredients to kind of match that. So if you go back to my earlier suggestion around using something like hing or asafoetida as a slight addition to your food to help create some of that kind of oniony, garlicky, leek, scallion type flavor set. Very, very small restricted use of that could make sense. Of course, like I said before, a little goes a long way. You can easily ruin a dish with just a little bit too much of that ingredient. So you want to be very, very cautious, but something that kind of gives a great characteristic flavor to those dishes. So I could suggest that for sure. In terms of technique, I would say, high temperature techniques, like I was describing the cast iron where you're developing external color and flavor. Also low temperature techniques for drawing out sweetness, for softening foods, for letting flavors meld and mingle. Those all become pretty important things to consider when you're looking at your overall approach to cooking, and you're kind of making the calculation of saying, great, I'm going to increase these foods, I'm going to decrease these foods, and I'm going to really apply these cooking techniques over these techniques. That almost, for me, when I think it through, creates a lot of opportunity to say, what can I do to build flavor all along the way? So instead of just saying, great, I'm going to roast carrots and finish them with some spices, I can think about, well, what do I want to do for acidity with those carrots? So I want to add a component to accentuate sweetness at the finish with some reduced vinegar or a splash of fruit juice? Or do I want to enliven it with some freshness and some citrus or some fresh herbs? Or do I want to make it something where it goes more creamy and add a little bit of a tahini glaze on top of that and make it kind of tacky and creamy and, just a little bit more hearty feeling almost? And there's all kinds of ways to approach that same thing, just in terms of what that aesthetic effect you want with that food. Next question here. Are nuts and seeds safe for someone with diverticulosis? I read mixed messages online. Given that my mom has that condition, I would like to have her enjoy a forced over knives recipe with nuts or seeds. Will soaking them help soften them to break them down easily? Patricia, this is really a question for your healthcare professional. Different people with this condition can tolerate different types of foods depending on lots of different factors. So I wouldn't want to suggest something that's not going to work for her. What I would suggest is that, you get some recommendations or guidance from her healthcare professional about where she is specifically and the sorts of foods that they may or may not recommend. Typically for people who are having those sorts of challenges, they're going to want to have things that don't have kind of that exterior hull or kind of the consistency, size and shape wise of something like a small seed. Purees, softer foods, more intact foods that can more readily pass through the system typically is what they're going to want. But again, I would rely on your healthcare professional for that sort of guidance. Donna says, and do not wash any container used to store hing or asafoetida in the dishwasher. Wash by hand, speaking from personal experience. So yeah, Donna is just speaking here about the kind of potency, we'll call it, of this particular ingredient. And just, again, handling it with some care. It's a very strongly flavored ingredient where a little goes a long way. And you just want to make sure that you're using it knowing that, it's going to make things around it and other foods that it might touch also impacted with that flavor. So not a negative thing. It's just one of those things you need to be aware of when you're working with hing. For batch cooking, i.e. a pound of beans, what size Dutch oven recommended? Do you like enameled cast iron? A pound of beans can easily cook in a 3-quart or 4-quart or 5-quart. It just depends on if you're cooking it with other things. I almost always cook my pound of beans in a 5-quart. because I have other stuff going on, I'll typically just want to have that extra room at the top for simmering, or if I'm adding things towards the end, aromatics, other vegetables, things, just depending on what I'm doing with it. But typically, if you have a 4 or 5 quart, you're going to be perfectly suited to cook a pound of beans. And I do like enamel cast iron. I own a few different types of enamel cast iron to cook in. So great. Next question. I need some help to solve a problem with a dessert recipe from a restaurant. The dish is churros, a deep fried pâte à choux. I'm having problems with the leavening and the texture. Where can I get some information about it? Well, you know, churros are a very common food eaten throughout the American Southwest and throughout Mexico, parts of Latin America. Essentially, it's a long donut. Many times churros can be leavened with a yeasted style dough, or with more of a chemical leavener style approach that uses baking soda. So just different approaches to having that lift. Basically you just need to find a way to create that puffiness and that airiness so that that texture is correct. But otherwise it's just kind of a long extruded donut, for lack of a better term, typically fried in oil and served as a street food style snack. Next question from Tanya. How do you get the onion smell off of your hands? Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that I've had to tackle, when I was a professional chef, just handling a lot of onions and garlic and different things for hours and hours. You definitely begin to smell like it. It can absorb into your skin. So some people just opt to wear, gloves when they're handling things like that, especially large volumes of things like that. And I'll wear gloves on occasion, depending on how much I'm handling and what I want to do later on. But really, it's just one of those things that it bothers some people more than others. I think if it's one of those things that it's not easily washing off your hands, try something like some lemon juice just to kind of get that acid activating and to freshen up your hands. But really, gloves might be a pretty decent option for you. Wonderful. Well, that does it for today. That's all the questions that we had. Actually ending up a little bit early today, which is nice. But thank you again for joining us. It's always just a real pleasure to have all the Rouxbe students joining for these live office hour events. And if there was a question we couldn't get to today, or if there's a response that wasn't quite detailed enough for you, please do reach out to us. We're always happy to help through our customer support or through our chef instructors. And looking forward to helping you in any way we can. Until next time, we look forward to seeing you, and happy cooking. Take care.